Well, let me add my welcome to Mikey's. Thank you very much indeed for giving up the time to be with us this Thursday lunchtime of the Sir Nick's Talks. I hope you've managed to get hold of the handout that Mikey mentioned. It's not vital, but it will be of some assistance. Can we trust the Bible? It's a long handout. I'm not going to be referring to everything there. It'll be material for you to take away and examine yourself. I will be referring to a number of points as we go, though. If you have it, then please turn to page 2, and you'll see on page 2 of the handouts the Atheist's Creed. Just scan through that, if you will, for a moment. I believe in the primacy of science. I believe in the total adequacy of evolution. I believe in what I can see, what I can touch. I believe in the goodness of humankind. I believe in me. I believe I only remain in the world as a fading trace. I believe in the finality of death, the rotting of the body. I believe in nothing. Clear statements which, of course, assume that there is no God and that life, therefore, has to be explained by naturalism. This, the Bible, what we are considering today, its authenticity, stands as a direct challenge to anyone who would make such claims or live by such an ethos. And of course, that raises a clear question, doesn't it? If we're going to suggest that the Bible challenges the materialistic worldview, then we have to ask the question, can it be trusted? And that is our topic today. Can this Bible be trusted? Top of page 3 on the handout, here's the proposition we'll consider. The Bible is not a collection of made-up stories, but is reliable history. It can be trusted. That is the proposition that I will try to defend. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at a city law firm not far from here on this subject. Everybody that I spoke to listened very politely, but at the end, one lady objected. Such a factual defense of the Christian faith is depressing, she said. Part of the intrigue of Christianity is the mystery and the faith that is required. Well, at the time I had huge sympathy for her. Like many, her experience of the Christian faith had been reduced to ancient buildings and ceremony, incense and pews and vicars and that sort of thing. That is a tragedy. That is an absolute tragedy. Things that actually matter about the Christian faith had been cut out from everything she'd experienced. Things that absolutely do not matter had been put in. Confusing ceremony, for example. Now, if that's the Christianity that you have experienced, I'm really sorry. If it's something related to that type of Christianity that you think we're talking about today, then again, I'm sorry, that's just not the case. We're talking about a Christianity that comes from the direct word of God himself, from the Bible, and is not something that's informed by human tradition. And so my experience is that many people within the city particularly have dismissed Christianity, but they haven't dismissed a Christian Christianity. They've dismissed a man-made Christianity. Again, I want to commend to you the authentic Christianity, which springs straight from the text that we're considering, the Bible itself. What would we find if we were to sum up the big idea of the Bible? Well, we'd learn what life was really about and what a useful life today consists of. We'll get answers to questions like, what happens when I die? And perhaps most importantly, we'll have the answer to the question of what it means to be able to relate to God today, what he does and does not want from people. You may find the diagram halfway down page 3 of interest, the different idea of world views. I won't say more on that now. For now, we'll jump to the top of page 4. Christians believe ultimately that the Bible was written by God, and that is a huge claim to make, of course. I can't prove that claim to you, claim that the Bible is written by God, but I can do something better. I can help you to prove it to yourself, which is ultimately a much better position to be in. You see, if the Bible really is written by God, then it must be the highest source of authority. And so the only way that you'll ever be convinced that it is the source of authority that I'm suggesting that it must be is if you look at it yourself. Let me try to illustrate. In my hand here, I have a gold coin. I know that's true because I've looked. I can verify, and I know for sure that there is a gold coin in my hand. If you were to look, you would see a gold coin in my hand. Now, the same is true in the Bible. Here is the Bible. In the Bible, you will find the Word of God. I know that's true because I've looked. The only way you'll know it's true is if you look for yourself. Now, that doesn't mean that has to be a private affair between you and this rather daunting-looking black book. You can speak to people who know the book. You can speak to people or read books about that book, things that will inform you, but all the time asking yourself, is that what the book itself, the Bible, is saying? That's the way you check for yourself. The way God chose to give us his divine words was, of course, through human authorship. So, capital B, still at the top of page 4. Let me tell you a few fun facts about the Bible. Still the best-selling book of all time, according to the Guinness Book of World Records. 5 billion copies sold to date, apparently. We talk about the book, the Bible, but of course it is a collection of 66 different books with lots of different genres of writing. It's historical, narrative, and poetry, and prose, and letters. There are 40 different authors from a huge variety of backgrounds. There's Daniel, Prime Minister. Joshua, a military general. Peter, he was a fisherman. And then we even have Paul, a lawyer, but don't let that put you off. It was written over a period of 1,500 years in 3 different languages: Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew. And it was written, not many people know this, on 3 different continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe. I think that's remarkable in and of itself. But then consider that this book that we're looking at today has a common storyline. From beginning to end, through those 66 books, you have the story of creation, fall of humanity, and then the redemption that God offers. You have a common message, a message that humanity has seriously messed up. God creates a perfect world, humanity completely turns that on its head. And God alone provides a free solution by sending his Son, the Messiah, the Christ, Jesus. And through this single book, there is a consistent personal challenge. Will we trust this God or not? So what about other religions? Top of page 5 now. Let me quote from John Dickson. He's an ancient historian. He says, unlike the Hindu Upanishads, which focus on the believer's merger with the life force Brahman, or the Buddhist Tripitaka, which emphasizes the extinguishment of self and suffering, or the Islamic Quran, which centers on the nature and practice of submission to God, the New Testament revolves around a series of events said to have occurred in Palestine between 5 BC and 30 AD. Essentially, Christianity is about Jesus, what he said, what he did, and is therefore open to a level of public questioning and examining. John Dickson, the ancient historian, he goes on. I don't think this quote is on your handout. John Dickson says, it is as if the Christian faith places its head on the chopping block of public scrutiny and invites everyone to take a swing. Well, today, that is exactly what we will do. We will take a swing. We will ask some important questions. And the rest of the time, I'm going to spend focus just on the New Testament. Okay, that's the bit of the Bible that makes up probably about the last fifth. Why just the New Testament? Well, partly because of time, but also because there are so many references in the New Testament, particularly in the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are so many references to the rest of the New Testament and to the Old Testament that if we can begin to make a case for those books in the New Testament, it in itself makes a bigger case for taking the whole book as a reliable source of evidence. There are two questions that we're going to deal with that must be answered. Middle of page 5 now. First, is the Bible reliable history? Second, has that history been accurately preserved? If the answer is yes to both, then I hope you'll agree. At the very least, the Bible must be worth a second look, maybe a grown-up hearing from your perspective. A, is the Bible reliable history? Some would say no. Let's bring out the big guns, relatively speaking. Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, still considered to be an important book from the atheist perspective. Let me just read from this well-known book. He writes, "The fact that something is written down is persuasive to people not used to asking questions like, who wrote it and when? How did they know what to write? Did they in their time really mean what we in our time understand them to be saying, etc., etc." And then the underlined bit, "Ever since the 19th century, scholarly theologians have made an overwhelming case that the Gospels are not reliable accounts of what happened in the history of the real world." Next paragraph, "Much of what they wrote was in no sense an honest attempt at history." Top of page 6. "Reputable biblical scholars do not in general regard the New Testament as a reliable source of what actually happened in history." Now, it's worth pointing out, when Professor Richard Dawkins writes reputable biblical scholars, what of course he means is scholars that agree with him, with his position. I could take you to countless reputable biblical scholars that don't agree with Dawkins and do agree that the Bible is authentic and reliable. But I'd like to do something better. Instead, top of page 6 now, let's consider what the New Testament says about itself. If it really is the higher source of authority, then let's give that a hearing. Listen to John. John knew Jesus personally. Eyewitness, friend. He wrote this, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands, concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it, testified to it, and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ." Can I just point out that the stakes are tremendously high at this point? John, who knew Jesus personally as a friend, he is claiming that he has fellowship with God, that is the Father. Look at that last line again in that handout. Our fellowship is with the Father. That means that John claims to be able to know God himself. How can he claim that? Well, because of his experience of meeting and getting to know Jesus. The language he uses, seeing, hearing, touching, knowing Jesus. That is an incredible thing, isn't it? John claims to be writing an accurate account of historical events about the person Jesus Christ. And he says that on the basis of getting to know Jesus, I have got to know God. But here's the most surprising thing. It doesn't end there. That offer of fellowship with God is extended to us as readers, as we're drawn alongside the person Jesus. See, John says his accurate account of the person Jesus is the means by which he knows God himself, and that if we engage with that accurate account, we too can get to know God as well. That is quite a claim, isn't it? Another book that's definitely worth looking at some point, it's by Christopher Hitchens. It's called God is Not Great. I think in his time, he died quite recently. In his time, he was considered to be one of the sort of the most respected atheists of the day, and certainly good friends with Richard Dawkins. In this book, he writes, "The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are hearsay upon hearsay upon hearsay." And I'm sorry, but from somebody with used to have such a high profile. I mean, that really does sound like he hasn't read them himself. The Gospels are not hearsay, but reliable testimony which emerges from and is verified by the eyewitness community. Now, in a sense, that it emerges from the eyewitness community is the point we've already established from John. Remember what he said, that which we have seen and heard. But it's also verified by the community. This is really interesting. You see, it's not that one man saw something and put together some notes, got on a camel, went over a mountain, found another community of people and convinced them that everything he had seen was true. Not at all. These accounts were being written into a community of people. And there are lots of tests that you can apply to test the validity of that. Some of the tests, for example, the test of geography. Did the Bible writers know enough? Were they close enough to what was happening to be trusted in what they were writing? Let me alert you to another book. This is a particularly good one. It's Pro the Bible. Can we trust the Gospels? He makes a case for it. It's one of the best reads I've had in the last few years on this subject. Peter J. Williams, Can We Trust the Gospels? He lays out in that book the argument of geography. He says the Gospel writers refer to bodies of water and roads and means of travel and gardens and details of the landscape all across the setting in which Jesus lived. And he makes the point that even if they had access to all the known material at the time from non-Christian sources, from extra-biblical sources, even if they had access to all of that, it still wouldn't be enough. Because the information they provide on geographic details in the Gospels goes beyond what would have been available to them. Instead, the Gospels themselves become a source of information which is accurate and reliable and unique. And geographical details can be seen and shown to be verifiable because of what the Gospel writers wrote. Now, that doesn't prove anything, but what it does do is eliminate objection. This book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham, he uses another test, the test of names. He argues again that the Gospel writers must have been very close to the event simply because of the names they use. Let me illustrate what I mean. You see, if I was to write a story today set in London, in our day today, and I used a whole lot of names in my made-up story, like Ethel and Deirdre and Joseph and Alfred and Ernest. Now, if you were looking at that story, you might say, well, yes, that's a good story, depending on whether it was or not. But you say, but the names are a bit strange. That doesn't really fit the setting at all. That sounds like he's taken a whole lot of names from 100 years before. Because all of those names were indeed the most popular names back in 1920. But in 2020, nobody's called, well, Ethel and Deirdre, not that I'm aware of. Those are our great-grandparents' names, not the current generation's names. They would be very quickly, that would very quickly be evidence that I didn't know what I was talking about, that I was out of touch with the current time. And the point that Richard Bauckham makes, of course, is that actually the New Testament writers must have been very close to the events because they wrote in the grain of the community to which they were addressing. People who had seen the events for themselves. You see, at every stage, the community had people who could have stood up and said, this story you're telling us about Jesus, the things he said and did, is just not true. But there are no records of that happening at the time. What that means is if you want to believe today that the New Testament is not reliable, then you would have to believe that the four gospel writers, all the thousands of eyewitnesses who read and observed those gospel accounts, and significantly, all of Jesus' opponents who nevertheless accepted that Jesus did live and walk and even did miracles, you'd have to put forward a case that they were all in some type of mass conspiracy together. Let's move on. 2/3 of the way down page 6 now on the handouts. The rest of the New Testament evidence comes from those who had personal access to eyewitnesses. I'm going to read here from the Gospel of Luke, the opening words. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Luke is writing so that his friend Theophilus might be certain about the things that he's been taught. See, this isn't fiction. This is an orderly account with a clear purpose to produce conviction. I wonder what you thought the Bible was there to do. One of the things the Bible is there to do is to give you certainty that the Bible is true. Someone may complain, well, it's easy, isn't it, to create a bit of historical fiction, notwithstanding the arguments you put forward on names and geography. You can research something very well, place a few made-up characters back in history, and then create the historical bit of fiction. If Dan Brown can do it today, why not in Bible times? Two things I'd like to say in response to that. Firstly, that genre of writing, the historical fiction, that did not even exist for another 1,600 years. So that would be quite a big claim to suggest that it did exist in the Gospels 1,600 years before it existed anywhere else. But much more significantly, you would have to ask what those Gospel writers had to gain. Dan Brown has made millions. The writers of the Gospels have obtained criticism, at the time ostracism, and in nearly every case, martyrdom. And anyway, it would seem an impossible thing to be able to pull off, simply because of the amount of non-Christian material that was written down at a comparable time. If the New Testament writers really were in a mass conspiracy with one another, then they did a pretty good job paying off and bribing the Jewish and Greek authorities as well. I've listed some of the historians from the Jewish or Greco-Roman source on page 7. Do read them in your own time. We're going to jump to the summary, a third of the way down page 8 now. This is a summary, I find this really interesting, of non-Christian sources that refer to Jesus of Nazareth. So for the real skeptic who said, oh, the Bible's all made up, then why don't you just go to non-Christian sources and look at all of the details that can be established about Jesus Christ. You can establish his name, the place and time frame of his public ministry, the name of his mother, Mary, the ambiguous nature of his birth, the name of one of his brothers, James, the fact that he was famous as a teacher and a miracle worker, the fact that people called him the Messiah and the Christ at the time. Jump to the end there if you've got the list in front of you. The report, this is really significant, the report of Jesus' appearances of his followers, Jesus' appearance to his followers after his death, and then the flourishing of a movement of people that worship Jesus after his death. In other words, you can establish a lot about the Christian faith. Look at the conclusion that Professor Craig Blomberg draws, second paragraph, top of page 9. A careful analysis of the genres of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts suggests that their writers were not only able to provide trustworthy history, but that they were intending to do so. The limited external evidence from non-Christian writers, later Christian writers, and archaeology almost always confirms, where they can be tested, that the evangelists did record accurate historical information. All of the above evidence is adequate to place the burden of proof on the shoulders of anyone who would deny the trustworthiness of untestable data. So, if you're listening in today, perhaps you were sent this link by a friend, perhaps you came across this on a flyer or through our website. Let me ask you a very personal question. What would be your reason for doubting the reliability of the New Testament? I mean, do you have access to information and material that the Christian community, the scholars, do you have access to information and material that they don't? To believe, to doubt that the New Testament is reliable, to believe truly that it cannot be trusted, is to cut against the grain of evidence. that I've laid out and that is available to us at this stage of history. I think what's probably the case, and certainly this has been my experience from speaking to many people in and around the city, what is probably the case is you didn't quite realize what the Christian faith is built on. I'd really encourage you to take a look, perhaps for the first time, as a grown-up. Take a look for yourself at the evidence. It's never too late to start, of course. That was the first question. Did they, the gospel writers, write accurate history? The second question, much more briefly, has that history been accurately preserved for us today? Another quote from Richard Dawkins. I won't read it all. In fact, I'm not going to read it all. He just levels the Chinese whispers argument against the Bible. And the argument sounds plausible until you consider some of the counter-evidence again. So small b on the handouts, third of the way down page 10. How do other ancient historical writings compare? Well, no end of textual, factual information that could be considered. Just look, for example, at the number of manuscripts that we have to be able to examine different phases of historical events. I think what stands out is the sheer number of historical manuscripts available to us today, built around the New Testament. 24,000, written in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Ethiopic. Look at the second point at the bottom of page 10. The time interval between when the document was first written down and the earliest surviving copy today. Take, for example, one event that no historian that I'm aware of denies, Caesar's Gallic Wars. They happened just before the times of the New Testament. The original documents were probably written down about 100 to 44 BC, sometime in that sort of 50 or so year block. But today, the oldest surviving copy that we have of that original document is dated to 900 AD. That's 1,000 years after the event. And yet, no historian today doubts the validity of the events reported in that document. If you have access to the handout, just glance on the back. Maybe you can just sort of get an idea of the little fragment. It's called P52. It's a little piece of papyrus that was found some years back now in a place in Egypt. It's called the Rylands. It's in the Rylands Library, and it's called the Rylands Fragment, as far as I can remember. Rylands Papyrus, sorry, P52, in Manchester Library. And it's a little excerpt from John's Gospel, John chapter 18. And it was found in Egypt. It can be accurately dated at about 130 AD. That is an amazing fact, because what that means is there were John's Gospels circulating in Egypt, quite a long way from the events that took place, within a quite short period of the events themselves. As another document, I mean, if you like this sort of thing, you go to the British Library today, when it opens again, and you go and see the Codex Sinaiticus. That is a complete New Testament, as we have it today in our Bible, and it's dated from the mid-4th century, about 350 AD. That's incredible, that they have a New Testament that you can see today with that date on it. Let me explain how these documents worked. Events took place, and people who were party to those events wrote down accounts, the original writers. Because those events were so significant, people got hold of them and copied them in their different languages. They copied them in Greek, in Latin. And so the Greek writers would write them, and then through the sort of thousands of years that followed, those documents would be copied and copied and copied and copied and copied. And then people would write them in Latin and copy and copy and copy, and in Syriac and copy and copy. The way you test the validity of those central events is to compare the copies as they exist later on in history. You can get a very accurate picture, therefore, of what actually happened in those first events. What you would find is that there is almost complete agreement with those different documents. There are minor variances between 1% and 3% of the texts that exist today have variances with each other. Things we're not sure about. Is the Greek one more valid than the Latin one? We don't know. And your Bible today, nearly every translation of a Bible today will have footnotes. And they'll say some manuscripts suggest. What's interesting, though, are two facts that come as a result of that. One, that means we can be 100% certain with between 97 and 99% of the New Testament that we read today as accurate. And those areas of variance between 1 and 3% of the text, depending on how hard line you want to draw it, they don't really have any significant value. Phrasing, grammar. Let me read Sir Frederick Kenyon's conclusion, second paragraph, page 12. The interval, then, between the dates of the original composition and the earliest extant, that just means surviving evidence, becomes so small as to be in fact negligible, and the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Both the authenticity and general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established. Where does that leave us? We're out of time. It's time to wrap up. I hope today something has been said that will have helped to persuade you to take a closer look at the Bible yourself. John's Gospel, I'd like to suggest, is the place to start. The handout has a final quote from John's Gospel on it, halfway down page 12. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, in John's Gospel. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life. You see, the words of the gospel are written down to give you something more than knowledge. They're there to give you life. That means a relationship with the living God who made you starting today. That gives you purpose and meaning in this life and hope, even as we face the grave. Now that is worth the challenge, isn't it? Take a look for yourself. See what you make of the Bible. Well, I hope you found today useful. I'm going to hand back to Mikey just to briefly close. Thanks, Mikey.